Very good evening to all of you. My name is Raj Kumar. I'm the Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University. On behalf of the Jindal Global University and the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, it is my proud privilege to welcome all of you to this World Environment Day virtual seminar on the theme, The Future of Our Planet, Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainability. We've had a fascinating day of intense discussions, beginning with the inaugural session in which we've had a keynote address by Honorable Mr. Justice Michael Wilson, a distinguished judge of the Supreme Court of Hawaii. We also had 4 thematic sessions on economics of climate change, scientific feasibility of conservation mechanisms, social impact of waste and its governance, and the 4th thematic session on the theme, What Glasgow Holds, the Future of International Environmental Agreements. The seminar has been quite interdisciplinary in nature, and we've had academics and scholars and lawyers and judges and people who work in the field of environment, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, research institutions, deliberating on some of the most important issues relating to environment. We are very delighted that we are entering into the valedictory and plenary session. We have we have 2 distinguished speakers, Honorable Mr. Justice Swatanter who will be joining us shortly, the former chairperson of the National Green Tribunal and former judge of the Supreme Court of India. We will also be having the keynote address by Professor Dr. Maharaj Krishan Pandit, former head and distinguished professor at the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Delhi, currently serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Institution of Eminence that the Delhi University has been conferred with. We have 3 other distinguished speakers in this panel. We have Professor Dr. Cosmin Corendia from Jindal, the Vice Dean of the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. We have Professor Dr. Mary Claire, who's Cordonier, Segger, who is a professor at the University of Cambridge. And we have Professor Dr. Radhika Khosla, who is the Research Director of the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development at the Somerville College, University of Oxford. What I thought I will quickly do is to, besides welcoming all of you, I want to say that there is something about what we in a university are focusing on this particular issue. While it is customary for universities and academic institutions to recognize and mark the occasion of the World Environment Day, this particular moment is quite significant. The fact that the humanity is facing the global pandemic and is responding with resilience, it's equally important that universities and academic institutions are fulfilling their own larger responsibility when it comes to speaking truth to power. Issues relating to environment and sustainability and climate change are at the heart of that empowerment that academic institutions need to foster. And that is exactly the reason why the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability has put together this virtual seminar. I also want to mention that one of the things that we have seen during the course of the pandemic is the extraordinary ability of human society to respond with resilience at a crisis of this kind. In my inaugural remarks in the morning, I briefly reflected about that resilience. But what I want to say is that one of the things that the pandemic provided for is that it did provide for a certain degree of time at hand to respond to it. And even though most of us were caught unawares when we had to face the crisis, I'm afraid the climate change crisis is not going to give that level of warning and flexibility. Whatever challenge and whatever crisis the human society will face, it will come so fast, and we are woefully and more inadequately prepared to respond to that crisis. And that is exactly why we need to bring to the forefront the challenge that we are facing as a society. So I'm very delighted that we have a distinguished set of individuals representing different institutions and different who are thought leaders in this field who have come together in participating in the valedictory session. Without further ado, I'm going to now invite Professor Raj Pandit. Ishan, I believe Justice Swatanter Kumar has not yet joined us, right?
He hasn't, sir. He's just joining us next time.
So I'm going to request and invite Professor Maharaj Krishan Pandit, former head and distinguished professor at the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Delhi, to deliver the keynote address. Professor Pandit is a distinguished scholar, somebody who has been working in this field for many years. He has also had the distinguished, reputation of having published in both science and nature, and who has been most respected and cited scholar in the field. And I'm very delighted that he has accepted our invitation and is agreed to be part of this. Professor Pandit, over to you to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you, Professor Raj Kumar. I hope it doesn't go downhill from here, but it's okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Justice Swatanter Kumar, who will be joining us soon. I had the privilege of many years ago, he invited me to National Green Tribunal to deliver Foundation Day lecture on 2014. So I know Justice Swatanter Kumar and his passion for environment. Vice Chancellor Professor Raj Kumar, distinguished colleagues at the Jindal Global School and wider audience. Well, Ishan has already thrice apologized, so I am now, it's my turn to apologize. It's okay. I have assiduously denied myself this pleasure of not being on the seminar circuit or that. But when an opportunity comes through friends and well-wishers, then you can't say no. So I'm grateful to Professor Raj Kumar and then Professor Ishan Chaturvedi, who followed it up later on. Thank you so much. Once I learned that there was constraint of time, so then I started, pruning and purging, and then I thought that there were a lot of, ideas doing hieroglyphics. What should I tell? What should I tell? That because as scientists, you believe in your data, you believe in facts. Well, they are important. They are necessary also, but that's not a sufficient condition to reach wisdom. It is not me who is saying it. It is Walter Benjamin who said it. So I often tell my students, because there may be some students here and young faculty, that unless you have a story, don't publish anything. Just do not put ink on white paper. Tell a story. So bring a story to the table. That's important. So within the constraints of that time, because as professors we are much practiced at the art of speaking, so 15 odd minutes is almost clearing your throat, but be that as it may. So I thought that I will bring to you a story today, a simple story of joining the dots, and when you join the dots of disparate disciplines, and many people would then believe me, how you can join disparate dots to make a story. And mindful of the fact that, there's an Urdu couplet which says that tum kaho to unwan badal sakta hun, ek umr chahiye fasana badalne ke liye. So if you say, he tells his beloved that if you say, I will change the title of my story, to change the story would take a lifetime. So I will go to my screen now, and can you see this now?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Excellent. So what I will do today is that I'll be talking about the serendipity of India-China neighborhood, why it was serendipitous, almost providence. I will talk briefly about it, the science behind that, and then the Himalaya, which became the wall, but also the bridge between the two great civilizations. But then we come to the recent, so I will complete about 55 to 60 million history in 2-3 slides. And then I go ahead and go to about 1949-50, then talk about the occupation of Tibet by PLA, and then how things changed from there. And then I will briefly touch upon, as I have done in my book, something called rice diplomacy, which India and China, indulged in. And then the result was 62 war. And the great, advancement that happened in the Himalayan highlands was this penchant of Chinese penchant for roads. They were much more aware. We became aware of these road building much later. And simultaneously in early 70s or mid 70s, something great happened in India, automobile revolution. I call it a streetcar named Maruti. And then how I call it road for road. So roads were being built there, roads started being built here, and what it brought ultimately, I will show you through data that how it led to this race of new automobiles being on the road and several roads being constructed, and we have this huge pollution load now on the Himalayan glaciers, and what is happening to Himalayan glaciers because of this pollution load. And then I would also briefly talk about what is the biological response to climate change in the Himalaya, and what is happening to once there is a biological response, how shrubberies are getting into the alpine meadows and how they are undermining the basic trophic structure of those alpine lands and the yaks, which are extremely important for the culture, for that culture which developed about 6,000 years ago or even more than that, and now that culture is under some kind of annihilation. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay. So this is briefly, about, so India was somewhere, if you can see here, India, we were somewhere, deep down here near Antarctica, where Antarctica, then suddenly this Indian plate, it decided to part ways with, Seychelles on the one hand, and then the Australian continent and went on a journey northwards. That's the only continent from the southern area which came north. It had a tryst with destiny with China, so it came. So it traveled about 4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers, roughly about 4 centimeters a year. It briefly was 27 centimeters, then it settled around 18. So currently it is about 1 to 2 centimeters a year. So it's still going northward. So this is what happened. I call it serendipity because because it was a long journey and it was the only continent which reached north, and roughly 60 to 55 million years ago, and there is complete agreement on the significant role. Now, a lot of people do sometimes ask me that so there was this. So there was the northern continent, which is the Eurasian continent, which is the part where the Chinese plate is there or Tibetan plate is there. And then the Indian plate that collided. So sometimes I tell people that collision at sometimes is good. It's not always bad, actually. So a lot of people ask me, why Himalaya? So just briefly to tell you that, the word that means the earth before the before and after the birth of Himalaya was remarkably different. It was a major geophysical change on earth. And Himalaya significantly impacted global and regional climate then and now. And then it's an important global biodiversity hotspot, which has the most diverse biomes on earth, much more diverse than Amazonian basin, let me tell you. And of course, it is geologically the youngest and the tallest mountain range, plus minus 8,000 meters. And biologically, it is the longest bioclimatic gradient. Unfortunately, it is the least known of the biodiversity epicenters, though there is very high plant species endemism. So there are 10 major river systems. It is the source of 10 major river systems. It is also called the third pole because of 40 to 60,000 square kilometer area outside the poles. About 1.5 billion people live in its basins, and importantly, as Professor Raj Kumar was suggesting, climate change, this happens to be the warmest mountain on earth. That's key. For me, it is home. That is why I work on the Himalaya. Okay. So most of these ideas are contained in this book of mine, published by Harvard University Press. So some of you who are interested to read more details, so they can procure a copy and have a look at it. Now, one of the predominant changes, geophysical changes that happen because of this continental collision between the Gondwana line or Indian plate and the Eurasian plate is that this huge wall came up because of the subduction and also the collision. And so on one hand, this huge wall came up and it did 3 things. One, it created a gradient of climate. Second, it created a huge elevational profile. The third thing, intercepted the warm, moist winds from going over, and a new phenomena called monsoon took shape. So monsoon, roughly around 20-25 million years ago. So monsoon shaped for the first time, and then the entire southern part of, or what's called southern declivity of Himalaya, underwent a series of processes of denudation because of everything which is at the top wants to come down under the impact of gravity. And then you have glaciers, then glaciers developed. Glaciers and the tropical latitudes and rains all together brought huge amounts of silt down onto that. On the other hand, it went to the Arabian Sea. On this hand, it went to the Bay of Bengal. So much of this was dumped. The consequence of this huge, huge detritus or sediment load coming from the Himalayan, slopes was that it soaked up much of the carbon dioxide. The ambient carbon dioxide was soaked by much of silicates and ultimately got dumped in the oceans. As a result, the global climate fell down by several degrees. So there was global cooling. So Himalaya of the first Cenozoic era was responsible for global cooling. So on one hand, you have global temperatures coming down because of what was happening in the Himalaya. On the other hand, what was happening is that when ambient carbon dioxide levels fell significantly, trees cannot respond to it. So trees couldn't know. So the forests in the sub-Himalayan tracts slowly started disappearing. And in that place, more of C4 savanna type vegetation started coming up, mostly grasses, which have a very specialized C4 photosynthetic system. And that now in areas where we had thick forests were replaced by grasslands or savanna type vegetation, and the fauna of that was dominated by frugivores, which are fruit-eating animals like Civipithecus, as you can see here. And slowly then they were being replaced by browsers and omnivores, and later on, much later, what are graziers, and ultimately these were, so much of the herbivore population and grazier population like horse and hipparion, they came much later. Now this was, now as this natural setting was happening. So I, some years back, wanted to check this idea that does rock shape life. So I gave this idea to Harvard 21st Century Program, and they liked the idea and asked me to lead this program. And we wanted to look how actually rock shaped life to begin with in the Himalaya, and then now the life is shaping the rock. So ultimately, this work is published. One more work is getting published very soon. Not only did this, shape the biodiversity, but also it shaped human cultures. And I often tell a lot of people, when humans to begin to have looked at from the plains, like nowadays you can see from Saharanpur and Muzaffarnagar, you can see Himalaya. So they would have seen a triangular structure. So most of our temples are triangular. But as you go up towards Sthethias, then you will see that it's flat, mostly flat roofed and mixture of flat roofed and triangular structures. But if you see Tibetan monasteries, which are in Tibet, which is an absolute plateau land, so most of the monasteries are they're a flat roof. There is no triangular structure. So this is just a kind of a cultural thing. Now, so leaving apart the past 60 million year or 55 million year history, let's immediately shift to what happened in 1949. I call it the tale of two titles. So for those of you who are interested in the history of Tibet's occupation, I recommend them this phenomenal book called Melvin Goldstein. I have written about it. So what happened during 1949-50 or early 50s was that Lhasa population at that time was 30,000. PLA population was 7,000. So 25% of Lhasa's population was of PLA. So citizenry to troop ratio was 4:1. Now, there was a problem because Tibetan government that time did not, though they had plenty of food grains, but they did not share those food grains because they wanted Pele to leave every time. So there was a lot of unhappiness among the troops that time. In fact, there was some minor revolt also happening among Pele troops because they were hungry, and they were hungry. And then, of course, there was an agreement in 1954. Prior to that, there was an agreement in 1914, which was called the Shimla Agreement. It happened at Shimla, not the Shimla Agreement of 1971 or 2, but this was the first Shimla Agreement in 1971. So China wanted sovereignty. British were ready to give them suzerainty. So I'm not getting into the suzerainties and sovereignty debate, but this agreement was doomed from the very beginning. So, so then Mao realized at that point of time that there was problem with the PLA. They were not getting enough food, so they were hungry. Some people were almost dying of hunger, and so therefore he ordered two things. They said that, well, half the PLA forces should go and start making roads, and half should clear the bush and start sowing so one for the bread and one for the road. So road building started in right earnest in 1952 in that area, and the bush clearing at that altitude started there. And they now had, because there was need of food there, roughly about 5.5 million pounds for the troops, and about 1.2 million pounds for that. Roughly about 7 million pounds of food was required for the man and the animals. At the same time, Chawanlai did something very, very tricky, because it took them roughly about 100 plus days to ship food to Lhasa from somewhere in Southeast China. So Chawanlai spoke to the Indian government, and then they told them that, well, it's very easy to open, if you give us access through the Sikkim, Nathula, border, then we can bring our rice to Bay of Bengal, and from there, from Calcutta through, then, Siliguri, and then it can go. So it brought down the number of days to manageable 20, 23 or 30 odd days. So that the then Prime Minister agreed for what I call rice diplomacy, that you give us 10% of rice for the Bengal state, West Bengal state. Chawanlai readily agreed, so they gave them. So we gave access to China through that. So the recent Doklam is not something new. So Chinese government kept on pushing more and more, and then the roads by late 60s, entire roads, and then of course it culminated in giving up of Aksai Chin to that, and more recently they created this entire line, what I call the first train to Lhasa. Now India was feeling some point of dismay, and also that we are not making enough roads, and Chinese army is sitting top. And then the 62 was a very horrible lesson that India possibly learned, and then therefore we also then engaged in this road building. And this is the current scenario. So there was this road for road on the northern side of Himalaya, the Trans Himalaya, and on the southern side of the Himalaya. So occupation of Tibet absolutely related to road building in the southern side of the Himalaya. Then came one Mr. Sanjay Gandhi, and he had this idea that we should revolutionize this. So a new kid on the block. So Maruti came onto the scene. Look at this. Look at 1983. You suddenly have this. Look at 1983. If you can see this right graph. So you had passenger vehicle production just going over the roof after 1983. The first car rolled out in 1983. And and what it did was, so everybody had a car, so they would put their parents and their possibly two children and somebody, let's go to Mussoorie, let's go to Darjeeling, let's go. So everybody went into this. So there was huge surge in tourist inflows. whether it was neighboring Nepal or wherever in that. And with this, you can see also, suddenly by 1983, then this gas and liquid guzzling started and our imports. So net imports started increasing. So on the one hand, so just one car, Maruti, made this huge difference that we were now guzzling gas like anything. And the consequence is that you have huge pilgrims, imagine, which was aided and abetted by the cultural awakening. And you have this now, tourists, about 200% increase every year or something like that, because most of our shrines are in the Himalaya, and Maruti came in quite handy. And look at this jump in 1983 pollution levels. Okay, today, this is a recent paper. Now you have black carbon loads which are very high in whether they are Mukteswar, Satapatha Glacier or glaciers, Himalayan glaciers. These are the black carbon levels. And that is what the result is this. So you have, when black carbon sits on the glaciers, you have glacial ablation happening. So glaciers tend to melt faster than if that's not there. So on the one hand, glaciers are melting because of this. And now you wish to connect, if PLA did not occupy Tibet, roads were not built, and Maruti had not come up, then we would not have this problem of pollution and huge passenger load, and we would not have problem of glacial melting. And at the same time, the local temperature also increased. This was this work which we published about a decade back, and we found that large number of species were now shifting northward because there was no place, because they found it very hot down below. So there was a northward shift happening that. So you can see most of these species are now feeling crunch. They are getting higher and higher in the Himalaya. And also the lives and lifestyles of people are also changing in the Himalaya. These are some of the endemic species which were earlier found at much lower elevations, possibly 500 to 800 feet, but are now seen much higher. And some of them have gone extinct because there's nothing. With the result, what is happening is that now this is a modeling study, which is also ground truth by us, one of my students, Kumar Manish, one of young, very fabulous researchers. So he did this study in Sikkim, and we found that the grasslands these alpine meadows were slowly being ingressed upon by shrubs, and the shrubbery was replacing. There's a photograph of Valley of Floods then, and this is now. So much of the shrubbery. So over a period of time, by 2070, we are expecting the herbs would have completely gone and shrubs would have. And one of the consequences, this is what we published last year, that now because of these problems, the protected areas are no more meaningful, because we would have to change the contours of protected areas because species have shifted. And one of the key animals that depends on these herbaceous alpine meadows is yak. And yak is an extremely important animal. It is because of the yak human population settled at the elevations. Without yak, human populations wouldn't have been able to occupy those Himalayan highlands. Because if you look at yak, the yak dung is very high in volume. It has high calorific value. It is used as manure in those very sandy soils, and it is the only fuel wood there. And as the 10th Panchen Lama said, no yak, no Tibetan people. And if you see, invariably, whatever your Himalayan highland people, whether in India or in Tibet, whatever they make whether tents, whether clothes, they make it out of. So yak is in life and death. It gives service to humans. And if the grasslands and yak populations decline or die, then this particular culture, this highland Himalayan culture, is going to be annihilated. Anyway, this was a small poem. I thought I would, but it's not important. So I've been giving calls intermittently. This was in 2013, that why Himalaya needs to be protected. This was published in Nature. And last year, I was again lucky to write another piece for the World View Nature, that why Himalaya should be a nature reserve. So that's all. So that's briefly my story. Maybe.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pandit, for a fascinating and a compelling tour de force on the importance of Himalaya, but more importantly, through that, the importance of the larger theme that we're discussing today, which is about environment and sustainability. For those of you who just joined us, I want to say that this is we had just had a fascinating address by Professor Pandit. Professor Pandit is a distinguished professor at the Department of Environmental Studies at the University of Delhi. He was also at the National University of Singapore, a Radcliffe Fellow at the Harvard University, a Fellow of the Indian National Science Academy. He has also been a very distinguished professor and researcher in the fields of Himalayan ecology, biodiversity conservation, and climate change. His book, which he just talked about, Life in the Himalaya, an Ecosystem at Risk, was published by Harvard University Press. It's an important reference material cited and referred to for people in different parts of the world, particularly in universities and academic institutions. A distinguished author, and I am grateful to him for his time and indeed his presence. Let's quickly move to the next part of our this evening. We have with us another distinguished, jurist, judge, and indeed an academic as well, who's deeply committed to ideas surrounding environmental sustainability. I have great pleasure in welcoming Honorable Mr. Justice Swatanter Kumar, former judge of the Supreme Court of India, former chairperson of the National Green Tribunal. Justice Kumar has had a very distinguished career, served as Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court and later in the Supreme Court. During his tenure at the National Green Tribunal, he was instrumental in delivering several landmark judgments, widening the horizons of environmental jurisprudence in India. These judgments were related to cleaning of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, lakes, air pollution, Himalayan glaciers, municipal solid waste, and protection of forests. Some of his judgments were of international scope, like those dealing with oil spills causing from sinking ships. He has also been a legal advisor at the Central Board for Prevention and Control of Pollution and a standing counsel to various government and non-governmental organizations and public bodies. As the Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court, he established courts at number of villages and taluk levels. For his contribution as a judge of the Supreme Court of India and Chief Justice of the High Court and the Chairperson of the National Green Tribunal, he has been bestowed with several awards. I must say that particularly his work at NDT has had a profound impact, and he introduced for the first time the practice of a consultative process of stakeholders in the dispensation of environmental justice in consonance with the legislative intent of enacting the National Green Tribunal Act of 2020 for expeditious disposal of cases. Under his leadership, the NGT held various international as well as regional conferences on environment. So we're very delighted and indeed very fortunate that we have had his presence in today's virtual seminar. So without further ado, I'm going to request Honorable Mr. Justice Swatanter Kumar to deliver his valedictory address. Over to you, Justice Kumar.
Thank you so much, Professor Raj. The distinguished panelists, distinguished speakers who have spoken for the previous sessions, and every member of the Jindal University. I think first and foremost, I would like you to have my sincere compliments for the university led by Dr. Raj Kumar to have this kind of and this level of this deliberation on the World Environmental Day, on which day I think environmental consciousness need to be complemented, and therefore it's a big effort. So my sincere thanks to you and congratulations to you and your entire team for having worked so hard to bring it together, the speakers from various ends, including our dear friend Michael, who is I thought he spoke at the beginning. what I wish to say at the very outset is that the topic which has been the source of this seminar is the future of the planet, environment, climate change, and sustainability. I would compliment to the person who's made this topic, because I don't think any part of the environmental jurisprudence falls outside the ambit of this topic. It is such a wide topic which, to my mind, evokes every environmental thought from any prudent person who has inclination towards environment. The second thing which I would say is that when we talk of climate change, now climate change would but naturally have two kind of degradations by which it depletes from the earth. One is a natural process as a result of which the climate change occurs. That is the natural elements which happened. And the second is obviously the man contribution into the climate change. And the climate change is such an important facet because the initial damage by the natural process is very limited. But the contribution by the men, that is the human beings over this planet, is very serious. Our present is the currency of our future. We are rich if we save this present, the natural resources of today, and poorer in terms of our own subsistence if we do not. Economic growth is often seen as independent of environment. Rather, it is believed mostly that the same can be achieved through exploitation of environment and natural resources. No doubt it is possible, but will such growth be sustainable? Definitely not. What nations need to work together for is sustainable economic growth, which is more equitably distributed, and such growth is solely dependent on environmental conservation and preservation. I believe that population control and meaningful utilization of our natural resources and the young human resources is the essence to prevent adverse climate change impacts. Environmental consciousness has been deeply embedded in the Indian culture since beginning of time. We have followed an environmentally sensitive philosophy, and such emphasis has been laid on environmental ethics, beliefs, and customs. Since the time immemorial, consciousness to ecology is manifest in Indian myths. Having done some work on the environmental law in the High Court, in the Supreme Court, and then in the National Green Tribunal, one could certainly say that environmental degradation in our country is very rapid. I think we are hurting the principle of sustainable development from all its impacts, all its directions, and it is a little difficult for us to realize the impact of climate change. Now, the climate change impacts are going to be on agriculture, on our day-to-day living, on our cost of living, and much importantly, on our development of the country as a nation. Common environmental threats plug all of us. These threats are population growth, rapid urbanization, rising levels of consumption, desertification, land degradation and climate change have combined to leave countries suffering from severe water scarcity. The highly disturbing trends are also making it increasingly hard for the world to feed itself, warned the scientists. Well, statistics you have learned from the various experts which have spoken from this period, I think, which I would avoid to refer to. But whether we talk of material consumption at the domestic or the commercial level, it is rapidly increasing. What I would advise us to look at is that the raw material of any facet of development, whether we talk of industrial development, whether we talk of economic development, whether we talk of construction activity, any facet of development understood in the common sense is taking its resources from natural resources of this planet. And we are extracting them by no restriction, by no limitation. And we are probably being very harsh and very, very harsh to the natural resources, the environmental elements. At this juncture, I would like to share with you a small experience that I had that is famously known as Shimla forest case, which, shows the kind of cruelty we are prepared to impact and inflict upon the natural resources, resulting in total variation of the atmosphere, the climate, obviously, whether we talk of a lot of technical terms like discharge, release of green gases, industrial gases, traffic emissions, everything. But let me tell you the small instance that if we can be so cruel, then I think that humanity needs to rethink its approach to environmental protection, resulting in proper adherence to the climate change adverse impacts. See, this was a case where a person owned the entire hill in Tara Devi place called near Shimla, around about 13 kilometers before Shimla. Now, this person had a small bungalow, 1 or 2 cottages, and the entire hill was full of forest. And it had round about 700 to 800 trees within that area, and which was sold to a builder. The builder obviously overnight he chopped off these 900 trees, which are more than 50 to 100 years old. Look their structure, look at their age, look at the consumption of, they will be releasing how much of oxygen, converting carbon dioxide. Now this all was done overnight. Within 12 hours, he chopped off mechanically all these trees, and he had a proposal of making a 5-star hotel there where there were 2 cottages, therefore wiping out the entire beauty of that hill, the necessity of that hill, and everything else. Now, kindly see that the impact on climate, today when you go to Shimla, you have to face air conditioners, you have to use fans. I was born in Shimla. If somebody talked of fans and AC in Shimla, he was called a fool. But that fool's version has proved to be correct today. Every hotel has air-conditioned rooms. Now, the gases which are released out of them, where do they go to? Now, while in that, even just to make out few lakhs, or let me put it, a few crores, he chopped off the entire hill, he converted it. Then the tribunal had to suo moto, put its foot down. There were compensation, there were directions for reforestation, there were directions for saving the trees, which stumps were there and they could be revived. Experts were directed, and they were asked to put up 1,700 trees in the premises, and around them 7,000 trees. So what I am trying to tell you is this, that kindly consider that element of a purchaser and a buyer, that they are ready to sacrifice all natural resources, and what will be the impact on climate. The climate of Shimla today is different. This is just a very small instance between two individuals. When we talk of raising construction over the roads, destroying the glaciers, when we were dealing with the case of Himalaya glaciers, right from Manali to Kashmir, you know what all we had to face? You know, people are least worried that, and the glaciers were giving up by 1 meter per year. So what are you going to do to it? So what is needed today? Needed not only because whether you talk of Atlantic, whether you talk of Himalayan glaciers, or you talk of rivers, whether you talk of any other natural asset that we have, it is but clear that you cannot afford to destroy natural resources, and in the name of development, you cannot damage and diminish the resources which the God has provided to you, to an extent that it will become difficult for the humanity to survive on this planet. And that is what we are heading towards. When we talk of development, the development must take the three globally recognized principles of sustainable development, polluter-pays principle, and precautionary principle, more importantly, applied them in every project of our country, every project of this world. Just because there will be some industrial laws, so economic benefits should never be permitted to completely throw out the environmental benefits, the environmental concern, and environmental consciousness. You know, with this, we have to work it out that, you know, now for more than 30 years, we are trying to hold different conferences across the world, whether we talk of, you know, any conference, Paris, whether you talk of, you know, sustainable conferences, UN charters, then the relation between human rights and between the climate change impacts is recognized. And you know that the Human Rights Council, in its resolution of 723, had affirmed that the climate change poses an immediate and far-reaching threat for full enjoyment of human rights. Now, that is the recognition that we give. The Supreme Court of India, in different cases, coming right from the Vellore case, then in the case of Indian Council of Environment Legal Action, then in Ganga case, everywhere you will find that the courts have turned their capacity, I think. I must say that the judicial creativity has led to greater protection of environmental laws in India and their enforcement, even better than legislative and particularly the subordinate legislative things which are in the name of. So it is not how many agreements, how many conventions at the national or the international level we sign. I think what it really needs is that how much of it we will enforce and how much of it we will protect in our country and across the globe. With this, you can also see now there's some questions that do arise for us to probably be examined is that is it time for the world to formally adopt a better way of measuring growth, which is more holistic and reveals a truer picture of progress and quality of life? Can we move beyond boundaries of borders and adopt a regime of global civic and world governance in a matter which are great concern for entire humanity? As we humans do realize, we are the major contributors to the current poor state of planet and its environment, as the entire idea of growth revolves around human development. Is time to time move beyond these small economic gains? Can we discover, invent and innovate methods to maintain economic growth and bring holistic prosperity to developing countries without leaving adverse impacts on environment and help them bring down their emissions. Now, when we talk of emissions, I certainly would like to share that, in the Mahalakshmi temple in South, I had the occasion to visit there, and 700 years old sculpture done on the walls of that temple shows that how environment was known to our predecessors, or the heritage that we have. They at that time have drawn circles dividing the entire universe into 3 layers: above the sea, below the sea, and the sea level. And they gave everything, how to protect each one of them, how to control green gases, how to regulate the zone layer. So this all is so much rich in our culture. I do not understand why do we need so many laws when our mental thinking is that we must protect environment and we must always try to work it out, the things in favor of environmental protection. And if we want to talk of raising the questions in relation to climate change impacts, the sustainability will be the answer. But sustainability has to be understood in its correct perspective. It cannot be so individualistic from man to man, state to state, nation to nation, and region to region. It has to be an universal understanding of sustainability that will tilt all its balances in favor of the environment, in favor of our natural resources, and we must ensure that we help each other to protect, because some nations may not be able to provide so much of economic advantage so as to take steps which would prevent from further and undesirable degradation of environment leading to climate change. But today we have to work out together, and I think it can always be said, and I was just reading somewhere the professor's comment who said that all the human beings on this planet must remember that they are licensees on this earth and not owners of this earth. I think it is so correctly and aptly said, and I think the academicians contribute a lot to develop a law in a country, and particularly the environmental jurisprudence has been well aided by academics, and we can really learn every day, but it is not necessary for us to call development and do things in the name of the development which are destructive of the fundamentals of environmental protections. So with these words, I thank everybody, and particularly Professor Raj, who is a great person who brought this institution to this level of international recognition. And I also thank all the professors, great speakers for the day and in this session. I think you were excellent, and your expositions were be of great advantage to the listeners and would add to the growing faculty of environment in these sciences in Jindal University. Thank you, all of you, please.
Thank you very much, Honorable Justice Swatanter Kumar, for again a very fascinating valedictory address. And I think one of the remarkable things about what you spoke is about how the issue of environmental consciousness has been brought to the center stage in the development of jurisprudence related to environment, while the Supreme Court of India laid the early foundations of linking issues relating to environment to the Constitution and fundamental rights provisions of the Constitution, it is you and your leadership in the National Green Tribunal which provided the sort of foundational approach and understanding towards bringing environmental jurisprudence to life and meaning, and to make corporations, companies, business enterprises, as well as government agencies accountable for their actions. Thank you very much for sharing with us those experiences, and I deeply appreciate your presence. Thank you to both Professor Pandit as well as Mr. Swatanter Kumar for being the lead speakers in this session. And now we quickly move to the part where we intend to have a panel discussion with our distinguished speakers. I'm going to now turn it over to Professor Cosmin Corendia, Vice Dean of the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, who will be chairing the session in which both Professor Dr. Marie Claire Cordonier Segger, Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor at the University of Cambridge, and Professor Dr. Radhika Khosla, Research Director of the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at Somerville College, University of Oxford, will be speaking. Over to you, Cosmin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all the speakers, all the distinguished speaker, and I would like to extend my thanks as well before the vote of thanks at the end of our session to all the speakers, wonderful speakers and lessons we had today in our celebration of Earth Day here at Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability at the Jindal Global University. A lot has been said, and there are many lessons, as I said, which can be learned. However, we have to look in the present and probably most focus on the future. We know what happened. We know how we reached here. We know how we are dealing with the environment today. But what is next? What is going to actually happen in the future when most probably, many times have been said, and I should repeat it as well, we are in the last minutes. If we are in the last minute when we can actually do something about the environmental degradation and climate change process we are all facing. We proved our resilience during the pandemic. However, we didn't prove our recognition to the environment, and we didn't prove so much our will, if you want, individual will, political will, legal will, and so on, the people who can actually shape the future of our planet in regards to how to manage the problems we are currently facing. More than that, the young people who are watching now, and the students from Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, most probably do not have so much time. We talked today about the extension of time, the meaning of time. However, it's probably less than a decade where something has to be done, especially for them and most probably by them, as it looked that the previous generations of us who somehow treated the environment as granted, the nature as granted, and we didn't look so much into the future and the legacy we are living on this earth. As Justice Kumar beautifully put it, we are not the owners of this earth, we are just blessed it for a while. So now I have the honor to introduce two wonderful speakers at the end of this of today, two distinguished academics and policymakers, and also people who can influence this process. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Dr. Marie Claire Cordonier Seger, who is presently a Leverhulme Trust visiting professor at the University of Cambridge, but she created a lot of momentum during the Paris Agreement and beyond, and she continues to do her work very effectively in regards to law and climate change worldwide, I would say, and especially with a huge visibility at the Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC. So, Marie Claire, it is my honor to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Cosmin, and special thanks especially to all of our colleagues in India and at the Jindal Global University, especially the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability, and our honorable keynote speakers. Like them, I especially appreciate the excellent organization and hospitality of our hosts in this important global conference on World Environment Day. I should wish you good evening and also good afternoon from the Gothic grey stone spires and misty mossy emerald fenlands of Cambridge in the UK. For anyone joining us from Canada or the Americas, good morning to you as well. In 2020, countries are facing critical global challenges, which will define the next decades, perhaps centuries, of our civilizations on this earth. The risks are real, and the science which interprets them is well recognized. For years, even as globalization gained speed, delivering equivocal benefits to millions, we have also been warned of emerging vulnerabilities. Scientists and others in the World Health Organization circles underline serious risks of a global pandemic, a respiratory disease, now a reality with the emergence of a novel coronavirus and the deadly COVID-19 outbreaks. Scientists, journalists, and others in nature conservation circles, including the Convention on Biological Diversity regime, have highlighted the risks and realities of a global biodiversity crisis, with thousands of entire species, their natural habitats, and their ecosystems on the brink of collapse due to our development choices. Students have joined scientists and many others in climate action circles, including in the Framework Convention on Climate Change regime itself, underscoring the risks and realities of a global climate crisis, with extreme weather events increasing, glaciers melting, sea levels rising, corals bleaching, droughts and desertification spreading famine, and humanity's capacity to adopt and implement sustainable energies, carbon negative infrastructure, technology, and lifestyle transformations, as well as nature-based solutions in time, very far from certain. When, together with countries, we celebrated the passage of the Paris Agreement on climate change under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in December 2015 in Paris, and its rapid entry into force 1 year later in Marrakesh, Morocco, a certain sense of constrained optimism permeated the plans of government authorities, international organizations and business communities, even the academic and civil society circles. However, implementation of the Paris Agreement and our other international treaties is not just an environmental or an economic or a social challenge. It is broader. It is a development challenge. And it responds directly to the world's Sustainable Development Goals. Concluded at the United Nations in September 2015, updating and replacing the Millennium Development Goals and predating the Paris Agreement by mere months, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and their 169 associated targets for implementation recognize in SDG 13 on climate change that the UNFCCC is a key forum to coordinate global response to climate change. In the SDGs, ambitious targets also cross a wide range of legal and policy challenges implicated and impacted by climate change and by our biodiversity crisis, including SDGs 2 and 3 on zero hunger and good health and well-being, SDG 4 on education, which joins us all here today, SDGs 6 and 7 on securing access to clean water and sanitation and affordable and clean energy, SDGs 9 and 11 and 12 on industry and innovation and infrastructure, on sustainable cities and communities, and on changing our consumption and production patterns, looking especially to my colleagues in Canada and the Americas. SDGs 14 and 15 seek to save the very life on Earth, life below water and life on land. And SDG 16, perhaps one of the nearest and dearest to my heart, promises us all peace, justice, and global governance that is actually capable of holding back these joint crises. The Sustainable Development Goals may be soft law. They may be aspirational, voluntary targets adopted to facilitate more coordinated or collaborative international and domestic action. But behind them is a circle of international treaties and organizations, of national laws, and of courageous justices, such as the judge who just spoke today, which makes these targets much more than simply soft law. They are binding. And we can see when we look across the world as scientists, as lawyers, as scholars, as well as implementers and practitioners, that everywhere that we look, myriad national regulatory bodies and other authorities across all spheres of human activity are struggling to meet each target. National progress on implementing the SDGs is monitored through country submissions of voluntary national reviews. These underline the importance of high ambition, progress on nature-based solutions, disaster risk reduction and resilience, loss and damage, the liability and compensation thereof, and the need for robust legislation and dispute settlement systems to implement our national environmental laws in a manner that helps us to achieve the SDGs. Already, nearly 5 years have passed since the SDGs were adopted. While the grand majority of signatory countries have embarked with determination on the difficult tasks of adopting and implementing domestic reform, discovering both pitfalls and plateaus and political intricacies, national experiences to date offer cause for both cautious optimism and increasingly profound concern. Civilization has reached a crossroads, with the global economy, nature, and humanity depending on ambivalent capacity for compliance with our sustainable commitments. And it is here that we turn to a consideration of the future. And for the students who are online with us today in this valedictory and plenary session, your future. I would like to end by referring specifically to the urgent, crucial need for global scholarship and entire careers in implementing our global sustainable development goals. In a book now nearly 2 decades ago, far, far out of date, humiliatingly so, and I will get around to updating it, called Sustainable Development Law, Principles, Practices, and Prospects with Oxford University Press, I outlined the need to turn threats and global challenges into opportunities. If we look at Sustainable Development Goal 3, good health, there's so much that can be done for those with a medical background, and even more that can be done to help to change human behaviors, to prevent, first to respond to the current pandemic, and also to prevent future ones that could be even more serious, if one could imagine. For Sustainable Development Goal 1, 2, 4, and 5, all of the opportunities there, not just the need for good scientific and social sciences and humanities research on poverty, on agriculture and food systems, on better ways to educate it differently, on gender equality. But also if we look at Sustainable Development Goal 13, climate change, and 7, clean energy, we need researchers and scholarship in everything from technology to lifestyle changes and consumers' willingness to pay. And we also need, of course, our lawyers. For SDGs 14 and 15, life on land and life below water, we need conservation scientists, but we need all the other disciplines as well. And this is why the theme of interdisciplinarity in environmental conservation is so important for this conference today. Because without the lawyers, without the engineers, without the medics, without all of those who could help us, including, should they become distinguished enough, the judges, which eventually happens to our lawyers sometimes when we're lucky, we won't be able to stop this crisis in time. And when we look at the commitments found under Sustainable Development Goal 16, we find one of the main means of implementation, the adoption of laws on sustainable development, non-discriminatory laws that will assist us with the development as well as the sustainability. And this is where I think there is a urgent, crucial cry for more scholarship. As COVID-19 slowly is beaten back, and as countries seek to respond and eventually recover, we have a global economy to put back into place. And we need to do it differently. We need to, as some colleagues say, build back better. Benedict Institute in Cambridge. We need to build forward. We need to be looking at the millions and trillions of pounds of pandemic recovery funding. We need to be looking at the laws, national and international, that are being adopted now, today, on sustainable resource management and controlling our use of natural resources in ways that are more sustainable. We need to look at the trade and investment agreements that we're adopting and consider how they can actually channel investment toward sustainable endeavors only. And we need to look at the new climate laws and the growing tide, the wave of climate litigation that is taking place. In one study that we did most recently, 167 of 188 nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement actually commit to reform explicitly and implicitly of laws and institutions. Where are those climate lawyers going to come from? In Canada alone, the country where I was raised, I would say that if we have a criminal bar of several thousand lawyers and a climate law bar of maybe 8, and 6 of them are my former students, there is a massive opportunity here for anyone willing. If you're a tax lawyer, turn to climate, carbon taxes. We need you. If you're a conservation lawyer, come to us and help us with nature-based solutions and structuring parks so that they can deliver the maximum reducing of emissions from deforestation and land degradation. If you're an oceans lawyer or a finance lawyer, help us to structure those blue bonds so that they work. And if you're a tort lawyer, we've got work for you. A lot of work for you. So my challenge for everyone, and I will close with this, is about scholarship, but also about careers. If you're listening today and you're thinking about your discipline, think instead about committing to 1, 2, 3 of the sustainable development goals about which you are most passionate. And make this not just your career, but your passion and your vocation. We need you in academia with researchers and teachers. We need you in government and in intergovernmental organizations, not just the United Nations, but all of the other international organizations, including the International Development Law Organization, the regional treaties, the different bodies that are working now, like the World Bank. My goodness, do they need help? And then, of course, as well, we need you in the foundations, in the advocacy groups. We need you to help us with all of that work that is required from the community level all the way up to the global Amnesty Internationals that are fighting to defend human rights in times of COVID, in refugee camps and other places that have been forgotten and abandoned. And we need you in the private sector more than anything. We need you with your ideas, your entrepreneurship, your ability to create something out of nothing for the sustainable development goals that are our global priorities in all countries, rich and poor. And we need you not just in those entrepreneurial opportunities, but inside the larger companies that are currently making the wrong choices sometimes, and inside the financial world, where we are starting to see finally some banks and some investment firms committing to only fund investment that is actually meant to meet the sustainable development goals. I think that in times of great crisis, there is also great opportunity. That is the world we live in today. That is the future that we are calling you to help and to be involved in and to seize as a day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marie-Claire, for this wonderful and compelling message sent out there, not only to students, but I think to everyone who cares at the end of the day about our environment and implicitly about our future. I will, without any further ado, introduce Professor Dr. Radhika Khosla, the Research Director of the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at Somerville College at University of Oxford. And I will kindly ask her to give her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cosmin, and everybody else who is part of this panel and has been part of this day. It's a real pleasure to be here. We have a long and important relationship between Somerville, Oxford and Jindal Global University, and one that is growing from strength to strength. Some of our stars at the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development are from Jindal, and it's a joy to see new ones come through the years. So we're all really delighted to be able to have this partnership flourish. Now, I want to acknowledge the importance of this event and the level of leadership that it entails. The environment has often been a side issue in many of our disciplines and discourses. And over the last decade, and especially over the last year, we have come to realize that we are not separate from nature and from the biosphere, but indeed, as some say, we are nature. And the environment is socioeconomically and sociopolitically embedded, and it is mediated through laws and institutions which we inhabit and we create. And so that is very much our starting point, and the starting point from which a lot of the work that I do emanates. Now, given that this is the close of a long day, there are three key points that I'd like to make that characterize our environment and climate debates today. And it's also telling that they draw and touch upon many of the things that the speakers in this session have said previously. I'd like to begin by placing our current predicament in the arc of planetary history. Now, if we look back at the Earth's history and look back for 400,000 years, way before humans lived on the Earth, we see the cycles of increase and reduced carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. And then if we start looking from about 1,000 years ago, we see a very different patterns compared to the cycle that we see previously, where you see an exponential increase in CO2 emissions. As of a few days ago, the CO2 emission levels in the atmosphere were at about 420 parts per million. And historically, before 1,000 years ago, we didn't really rise above 250 ppm. And so this level of 420 parts per million is something we have never seen before. Now, the reason why CO2 is important is not only because it causes warming today, but because it is a greenhouse gas that lives in the atmosphere for about 100 or 200 years, once it is put into the atmosphere, it stays. And it stays and it continues to warm, and it's agnostic to the time scale of when it arrived. Now, this particular property of carbon dioxide, which allows it to stay in the atmosphere and continue to warm, irrespective of when it was put there, brings us to a profound tension and an ethical question that has long characterized the climate conversation. And that is, how do we consider and take responsibility for our role in the arc of planetary time and space? When we look from one lens, countries like India are among the top 3 emitters globally. So India's emissions are extremely large and cause for great concern across the world. But if we look from another view, from the view of emissions per capita, that is how many emissions is each person consuming or responsible for, we see that India's number is well below the global average, and it will continue to be well below the global average for a long time. Now, this view of responsibility and therefore, who really created the problem and where should solutions lie has long plagued the climate debates, and often to a detriment, because it's sort of taken us to a kind of stasis which we haven't been able to get through. And international agreements and climate impact realities now require us to move beyond fully answering this question, because unfortunately, those from the poorest parts of the world and a place like India is part of that, to the extent that it is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate impacts and climate dangers. But I do want to sort of keep that question of how we engage with that idea of responsibility and the implications of that idea of responsibility as key to the way we consider and move forward as we think about these climate debates, particularly for this group of students that we're talking to today, as it's important that we work out how to construe justice under these conditions, one that is fair, not just currently, but also intergenerationally and also spatially. And so sort of holding that view of responsibility and working through that question in a way that we haven't been able to work through up to today is really important as we move forward and find solutions to this issue. Now, the second point I want to make is that for us to be successful in our nurturing, preserving, and protecting of the environment, it requires not this divide of choices that are for the environment and for development. And that's, that sort of, that dichotomy has been so key to the way that we have thought about the environment, particularly in a sort of domestic context, but more broadly as well. And actually shifting to understanding what are the ways in which enhancing the environment can be mainstreamed into questions of development, right? So we're at a stage in the country's growth where our priorities are multiple and they are also simultaneous. We're together dealing with extremely profound questions of jobs, of housing, of health, of increased services, of clean air, of clean water, of land, and of mitigating climate change. And when you have multiple priorities that are simultaneous, all objectives will not be met at the same time. And there will be synergies and there will be trade-off. Decisions are made about one versus the other, prioritizing one objective over the other. And I think it's fair to say that climate change is often at the bottom of the totem pole in these priorities. Climate change is not the priority for our urban services. It's not the priority for national policymakers. It's not the priority often of the individual or of a homeowner. And so while it is inextricably linked to each of these priorities, the way in which we engage with it and the way in which we engage with the trade-offs that we make around climate change are often implicit. And so I think the work that we all do and the work that a number of our students are to do and sort of, Marie's call for more lawyers to engage in these questions, it's really important that the patterns of exclusion that our current thinking around trade-offs reinforces are brought forth, right? And that we mainstream thinking about climate change and into our development processes at policymaking institutions and also in our pedagogy. Now, the third point I want to make is that I want to shed light on India's moment in its climate and development trajectory. We just heard about sort of, this global moment around climate and the environment. But I think India's movement in this climate and development trajectory is particularly special. And the reason for that is that the bulk of our infrastructure is yet to be built, right? And that is both a large opportunity, but it's also a really large challenge that is ahead. The urban population of the country is expected to double anywhere between 2015 and 2050. And 2/3 of the buildings that will exist in 2030 were built in the last 20 years, right? So we're basically adding an equivalent of a Chicago a year in terms of real estate every single year to the country. Now, how this infrastructure is designed, shaped, and implemented is key, not only because roads, buildings, and bridges are one of the longest living components of the economy. So for instance, these structures once built, they live for 50 to 100 years, but because shaping infrastructures, we also shape lifestyles. And I was reminded of this in Professor Pandit's talk when he talked about the Himalayas and how they shaped a certain lifestyle. And infrastructure does the same thing, right? Once you construct something that's going to last, it shapes the way in which people live. Now, the moment we're in the country's trajectory is one where we can shape lifestyles. And that is only because we have this extraordinary window of growth that is upon us and is unfolding as we speak. The availability of public space, of public transportation, of energy efficient built environment, once that is put in place, it enables certain behaviors. So for instance, if there's a metro station walking distance from your home, you are much more likely to avoid using a car. Perhaps you make a decision not even to own a car because you can walk to a public transportation site. But if you were not able to walk to one, you would end up using a car potentially or buying one. If your home is well ventilated, you will probably use the air conditioner much less frequently. Now, on air conditioners, I'll throw in a fact because in the summer that we're in right now, we're so easy to put on an air conditioner, but actually air conditioners turn out to be a great blind spot in our debates. And the statistic is from the IEA that we are adding 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years. So as the world is adding 10 new air conditioners every second for the next 30 years, the majority of which are going to come from India, leading to emissions and energy consumption larger than most other energy demand sectors. So I think it's important that, that we think about climate change not as something that happens only at the level of governments and policy making, but as something that is linked to our everyday lifestyles. And we might think that everyday lifestyles don't add up to much, but as we showed in a chapter that I co-led in the United Nations Environment Program's Emissions Gap Report last year, lifestyle emissions globally account for 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And these lifestyle emissions are tied to three main categories: to mobility, so how we travel; to food, so how we eat; and to our residences, so how we live. Now, India's place in its own growth story is one where it could shape these infrastructures and the lifestyles and the institutional behaviors that come out of the infrastructures that we build. But we are at a closing window of opportunity before we have built too much without thinking deeply about how it is that we are doing so. So perhaps with that, and in the interest of time, I might end. I think today is a really important reminder of the embeddedness of the environment in our everyday life and of our collective future that comes out of that, and also of the looming threats from climate change, which are already upon us. Now, in thinking about our role in terms of how to tackle this, I find Mike Hume's quote very poignant, which is that climate change is not so much a discrete problem to be solved as it is a condition under which human beings are able to make choices about the way we live and the way we govern ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and thank you very much for keeping up the time. In India, it's getting quite late, so I realized that we are over our schedule with just a few minutes, but I think we can manage that. Before I end, I would like personally to thank all the speakers and honorable guests we had today in our event. Hopefully this event will become more often and not necessarily only once a year during the Earth Day. And I would like to also thank personally to Professor Ishan Chaturvedi, for being the brainmaster behind all this organization, which was absolutely impeccable. Now, Ishan, you have the floor, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cosmin. And now, it is my absolute pleasure that I get to deliver the vote of thanks. I am also aware of the fact that the more successful an event is, the more the burden of vote of thanks is, because an event is successful when there are a lot of people.
Justice Swatanter Kumar wants to say something. It seems he was raising his hand.
Okay. So as I was saying, the greater the burden of the vote of thanks is, because so many people have come together to deliver the event. But as much as I'm tempted to thank everyone, I want to start with and complete the life cycle of this session, because I remember that Dr. Pandit started with an Urdu couplet, his talk. And I just want to, because the theme of this event is the future of our planet, environment, climate change, and sustainability, I'd also like to respond with an Urdu couplet, which is almost poignant to what we have been discussing, which says, "Lamhe khata karte hain, sadiyan saza paati hain," which means that momentary mistakes make centuries suffer. And since time is of the essence, and that has come through all of our discussions today, I think that is one thing that we could all take with us, that even in the smallest of moments, we need consciousness, capacity, knowledge capital when it comes to environment. I would like to personally thank Professor Raj. Professor Raj has been managing this event, has been there throughout. In fact, Dr. Pandit and Justice Kumar, both of them were referring to the topic. He designed the topic himself, and it shows in how well it was received. Dr. Arvind Rosenkrantz, who is the Dean of the Jindal School of Environment Sustainability, Dr. Cosmin Corendia, who is almost always available for us, even with the little bothersome queries that we have about everything. All of the speakers for this session, Dr. Pandit, Honorable Justice Swatanter Kumar, who is my mentor, my inspiration to have joined the profession, Dr. Marie-Claire Cordonier Segger. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us. Dr. Radhika Khosla, thank you so much for being so prompt. All of our speakers throughout, all of our dear friends at the JGU faculty, they were very, very collaborative in their efforts. They were also very interested in being a part of this event. I must also thank and there's a bit of a soft spot and a bias there, our very own Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability faculty, who've chaired the sessions, who've managed everything from the back end. And none of this would have been possible without the whole faculty coming together. So thank you, all of you. The outreach and social media teams, the IT teams who work tirelessly. We have been creating Zoom links, we've been creating posts, everything about it. And none of this would have been possible without each of you. Finally, to the students, to the people who are listening to us, Dr. Marie-Claire referred to you, Dr. Khosla referred to you, Cosmin referred to you. We need all of you. And the theme of all of today's seminar has been how various dimensions of environment need to come together. The economics of it, the sociology of it, the law of it, the science of it. While we were discovering these through our sessions, we also stumbled upon biodiversity as an element, and gender as an element of environment, and religion as an element of environment, international relations, the pandemic, security studies, personal hygiene, public health infrastructure, comparative public administration, arts and architecture, linguistic abilities, all of these things came within the ambit of environment through our discussions today. So I just hope that these conversations continue. I would finally end by saying that thank you in the English language is supposed to stand for the completion of a tangible or an intangible transaction, physical or human transaction, intellectual or any other sort of transaction. So while I do thank you, I hope that this is not the completion of that transaction, and we've only started the action towards continuing this conversation every year, and hopefully, as Cosmin said, every couple of months. So thank you all, and please have a wonderful day, wonderful evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you.